So what's the feeling like there today in the UK as so-called Freedom Day gets underway?
Yeah, Freedom Day probably doesn't feel very free for the hundreds of thousands of people who the government has told will need to self-isolate after having come in contact with somebody who later tested positive for the virus, nor will it feel very free for Boris Johnson, who at the moment is actually in isolation until next week after he came in contact with the health secretary who tested positive for the virus over the weekend. But unless you're those people, or unless you're one of the party animals who ended up at the nightclubs, which opened at midnight last night, and they wanted to be first in line, unless you're those people, most people probably wouldn't notice a really huge difference. I took the London Underground to work today. The vast majority of people were still wearing their masks. I popped into the barber shop. The barber was wearing their mask. Next door at the coffee shop, though, the employees were not. And they're not legally required to either. So the government has really left it up to each individual and obviously to employers to figure out what's best for them. Peter?
Hey, just veering off message just briefly here. Have you seen the movie Team America? You've seen the movie Team America, right, Scott?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And you know the song? It's in my head now. Freedom isn't free. That's all I can think about at the moment. We've got Freedom Day, but it's not quite free, is it?
No, it's definitely not, especially considering the circumstances that we're in. This is sort of uncharted territory that the government is taking this country into. And most people, it seems, in this country are understandably nervous because on the one hand, you have deaths and hospitalizations, which are still relatively low. You also have daily case counts, which are terrifyingly high. We're talking about 50,000 a day. And just for context, the last time around, the previous peaked out at about 60,000 per day. And so, yes, there's no longer as strong of a link between getting cases and then, hospitalizations and then death. Obviously, the vaccines are helping. 2/3 of the adult population have one, but still, there is plenty of concern now, for one thing, of new variants, because government scientists said just in the last 2 weeks that the conditions right now that exist in the UK, where you have a very high rate of vaccination, but also a very high rate of new cases, that creates the perfect conditions for a new variant to potentially sidestep and get around the protections of the vaccine, which obviously would have huge implications here, but also abroad, Peter.
Yeah, and I was watching the press conference with Boris Johnson a little bit earlier with the Chief Health Officer as well, London's version of the Chief Health Officer, I should say. And he mentioned that of all the hospitalisations at the moment, 60% are unvaccinated. So does that lead you to believe or assume that 40% have either been vaccinated or have had double vaccinations and are still going to hospital at the moment?
Well, I don't recall the specific line that he said, but I think what you'll find is a lot of the people who are double vaccinated still getting the virus and ending up, hospitalized or dying is, people who fall into the older age category. So you have younger people who continue to spread the virus like wildfire, but ultimately, the medical officers here in England have said time and time again, and today at the press conference they repeated it again, vaccines are not foolproof. They are not 100% guarantee of anything. Yeah. You can still get the virus even after being vaccinated. You can still transmit the virus after having been vaccinated. You can still die after having been vaccinated as well. But the numbers are much, much, much lower. Both of the main vaccines that they've been using here and studied for a long period of time relatively are in the 90% in terms of preventing hospitalization, certainly in the 90% plus in preventing deaths.
All right. CNN's International Correspondent Scott McLean, really appreciate your time this morning, and I'm sorry if I've given you the Freedom Isn't Free earworm for the rest of the evening. We'll chat to you soon. Scott McLean, live for us in London. Thank you, Scott.